I think a lot of the week was given over to infrastructure, whatever that means. President Biden has his $2.25 trillion plan, a lot of semantics about what was included, what's not included. And I want you to address that as an economist. How important is it to get clear about what infrastructure is? Because President Biden said it's bridges and tunnels. Sure, it's also broadband internet. But then he said it's anything that enhances the life of the middle class. That seemed a little broad.
Look, what's most important is that we make the investments as a country that we need to, not what we call them. We need better bridges. We need to expand broadband. We need to build more schools. We need to make sure there's adequate housing for low-income families. The semantics really aren't so important. Frankly, I'd have liked to see more traditional infrastructure in this package, because I think we're decades behind, and I'm not sure this is big enough to bring us to the forefront, and I'm not sure there's enough really major, large-scale projects. There's $80 billion to help Amtrak's operating budget, but there are no major new systems. So I'd have liked to see a bolder, bigger vision on infrastructure. And the other thing I'd have liked to see, David, is more discipline. Discipline to make sure we procure in a cost-effective way. God knows the First Avenue subway in New York costs 7 times as much per mile as the subway in Paris, and they're not especially efficient in Paris. I'd have liked to see more speed in implementation. I've talked many times about a bridge near my office at Harvard, a 300-foot bridge that took them 5.5 years to repair. Well, you know, Julius Caesar built much longer bridges in 9 days. And I'd have liked to see rigorous analysis, and we may get that analysis, that this spending's going to be incremental. For example, there's no question we should have electric charging stations across America and electric cars, but we built gas stations without the government ever paying. Does the government really need to pay as much as is contained in this bill to get electric charging stations across the country? So I think Democrats are completely right on the need for much more resources, but I think some Republicans have a point when they emphasize efficiency, when they emphasize alacrity, and when they emphasize discipline in setting the functions. But this is hugely important for our economy. This is certainly worth, in many of the areas, substantially more government borrowing.
So it's hugely important to get the money to do the investment, but it's almost as important to make sure that it gets done right, or as close to right as possible. You've worked at the top levels of government. Do we need to rethink the way our government really administers itself in this sense? When was the last time the U.S. government spent $2.25 trillion and did it the right way? Can we have a rigorous system for return on investment, which is what you do in a corporation, to say, okay, we'll invest this money, but this is what we expect back?
This should be a huge priority in the design of all of this. But of course, more extensive review can be the enemy of more alacrity, but more speed. But I think we, with the right kind of administration, can do much better. Take an area like high density power lines. The issue there is not lack of money, it's lack of regulatory approval. And we got to figure out how to get the states cooperating so each state doesn't hold up all the other states in that area. I'd like to see President Biden talking more about the importance of doing it well and acknowledging more some of the past failures. On the other hand, I think there are some who seize on the semantic issues, who seize on some of the things that weren't great, who give the Pentagon a complete pass on every failed weapons system. But if some mass transit system in an urban area doesn't work exactly right on schedule or overruns its cost, go into a state of hysteria. And that's wrong. And so I'd say to my friends in the Republican side, let's have some symmetry in what you're prepared to do with respect to military procurement and what you're insisting on in these areas.
Larry, another big story this week were the IMF meetings, the spring meetings of the IMF, and it really underscored something we're watching, which is increasing divergence around the world, both in terms of the vaccination programs as well as in the economic growth. We see it even between the United States and Europe at this point, but then when you go to the low and middle income countries, it is quite stark, both on the vaccination rate and also the economy. What can and should be done about this? This is something you've been talking about for well over a year now.
Look, what we understand better today than we did 6 months ago is that this is going to be heavily about the ways in which the virus does or does not evolve. If it stops evolving, we're going to get this problem completely under control. If it keeps evolving, it's going to become an endemic problem. And evolution happens in proportion to how much the virus is all over the world. And that means uncontrolled COVID anywhere is a big threat to people everywhere. And if you're living in Pittsburgh, you've got almost as much risk from uncontrolled COVID in Lagos as you do from COVID in Philadelphia, because a new strain will get everywhere within 3 or 4 months. And that makes it absolutely essential that we have a global vaccine effort, a global testing effort, and this is a critical point that I've been working on, we're going to have one of these things every decade or so. We're going to have a threat like this every decade or so. And we need an infrastructure to make sure that we're constantly watching and ready to stop it at its source at the beginning. And that's what we didn't have this time. You know, the economist term for it is a global public good. We've got to support the international financial institutions, especially in providing the resources that do what's necessary. My sense is that with the necessary annual costs for prevention in the $10 billion range, or maybe even less, and the cost of this in the trillions of dollars, that the single highest return investment that can be made globally is in infrastructure to prevent these from recurring. And the second highest investment we can make is in getting this thing under control.
Okay, Larry, let's wrap this up with a quick line. A lightning quick round of Summer says, start off with central bank digital currencies. Much the vogue right now. We've learned that most central banks are working on a digital currency. 5 years from now, will the Federal Reserve have its own digital currency?
I doubt it. It'll have a bunch of stuff with digital accounts, but no real digital currency.
We also heard this week from Secretary Treasury Yellen, about coordinating with OECD on a corporate minimum tax internationally. Is that going to happen within the next year?
Bravo, and it's going to be as or more important than the next trade agreement we reach with some other country. This is the international integration issue of this moment.
For some of us living in New York, we got hit with a big new tax. If you made a lot of money in New York, you're going to pay a lot more taxes here. There's a lot of concern about that, individual stories about people moving away. But in the larger sense, do you think this might affect the economy of New York State?
You deserve to pay more taxes. It should happen. But New York City and New York State can't do it alone without substantial consequences in this environment, and I am very fearful that, particularly without federal deductibility, this is going to do a lot of damage to New York's tax base and set off a downward spiral.
And finally, Larry, the big story from last week with Archegos, the sort of implosion of Archegos. Should we expect within the near future more regulation of family offices?
I wouldn't be surprised, but even more, I'd expect more regulation of prime broker lending.